Imagine your ex-wife loudly mocking your simple suit in front of a crowded ballroom. She ruined your life 8 years ago, and now she wants to humiliate you one last time. But as she brags about her wealthy new husband, she has no idea he is secretly drowning in massive debt. And she definitely doesn't know that you're the anonymous billionaire who is about to deny his final bailout. Sometimes the most devastating revenge is absolute silence. Watch until the very end to see exactly how this brilliant trap snaps shut. Before we step into the ballroom, please take a quick second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment below letting me know where you are watching from today. I absolutely love seeing where in the world my viewers are tuning in from. Now, let's get into the story. There's a distinct difference between loud money and quiet wealth. Loud money demands an audience. It shouts from the center of the room, draped in designer labels, desperate to prove it belongs. Quiet wealth doesn't need to shout. It stands near the edges, comfortable in its own skin, observing a room it could buy twice over without ever feeling the need to mention it. I learned that distinction the hard way, over decades of building, breaking, and rebuilding. It was a crisp November evening when I found myself stepping onto the polished marble floors of the Plaza Hotel for my 25th University Alumni Gala. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, aged scotch, and an undercurrent of desperate nostalgia. Chandeliers cast a warm, golden light over a sea of tailored suits and silk gowns. Everywhere I looked, people who hadn't spoken in decades were engaged in the familiar, exhausting dance performative success. They traded business cards like playing cards, subtly inflating their job titles, measuring their worth against the ghosts of who they used to be in their 20s. I felt a gentle pressure on my arm and looked down at my wife, Clara. She wore a simple, elegant emerald dress that didn't demand attention, but commanded respect from anyone who happened to look. Clara was a woman of immense warmth and quiet intellect, the kind of person who could disarm a hostile boardroom with a soft smile and a precise question. She didn't need the glitter of this gala to feel valuable. Beside her, I wore a bespoke charcoal suit. There was no flashy watch, no visible branding. It was just the quiet armor of a man who had long ago stopped seeking validation from strangers. They seemed tense, Clara murmured, her voice a calm anchor in the swirling noise of the ballroom. I offered a slight nod, scanning the crowd. She was right. Beneath the clinking of crystal and the overly enthusiastic handshakes, there was a rigid tension. It was the anxiety of people terrified that someone else had won the invisible race we had all implicitly started on graduation day. I realized, with profound sense of gratitude, that I was no longer running that race. At 54, my life was built on bedrock. The empire I had constructed from the ashes of my past operated silently, far away from the flashing cameras and social media updates. My peace was absolute, protected by a fortress of anonymity and the unwavering support of the woman standing beside me. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, letting the ambient hum of the string quartet wash over me. For a moment, it was a perfectly serene evening. I was merely a spectator, enjoying the theater of it all. But some piece is fragile, or at least easily interrupted. The disruption didn't come in the form of a shout or a crashing glass. It came as a sound much sharper, cutting through the jazz and the polite chatter like a blade slicing through silk. It was a laugh, a loud, performative, overly rehearsed laugh designed not out of genuine amusement, but calculated to pull the attention of everyone within a 50-foot radius. My posture didn't change. My expression remained entirely neutral, but a cold, familiar weight settled into my chest. You can go 8 years without hearing a specific voice, without seeing a specific face, and still recognize the exact frequency of their arrogance in an instant. Clara felt a slight shift in my stillness. Her gaze followed the sound, landing on a small cluster of people near the Champagne Tower. I didn't need to look to know who was holding court at the center of that circle. The storm I had left behind almost a decade ago had just walked into the room. Helena, hearing that laugh, pulled me sharply back through the corridor of years. 8 years is a long time, but betrayal does not age. It merely calcifies, turning from a raw wound into a permanent, hardened truth. It was never the simple dissolution of a marriage that nearly broke me. It was the ruthless architecture of her exit. Back then, I was the proud founder of a boutique logistics firm. It was not glamorous work, but it was fiercely honest. I spent my mornings negotiating complex freight contracts and my midnights poring over logistical spreadsheets, steadily building a reliable foundation for our future. Helena tolerated my relentless hours only because she enjoyed the affluent lifestyle they provided, yet she always viewed my industry with a thinly veiled disdain. To her, logistics was hopelessly pedestrian. She craved prestige. She demanded the spotlight, and she viewed me merely as the unseen stagehand whose only purpose was to ensure her lights remained brightly lit. I never saw Marcus coming. He was a charismatic conversationalist with a taste for bespoke Italian tailoring and grand, sweeping ideas about launching a high-end luxury import enterprise. What he lacked entirely was capital. Helena found his superficial ambition intoxicating, but she did not simply pack her designer luggage and walk away to chase a more exciting life. That would have required a measure of integrity. Instead, she and Marcus orchestrated a meticulous, systematic extraction of everything I had built. While my attention was consumed by expanding our international shipping routes, they were quietly and methodically draining our joint financial accounts. Worse still, she handed Marcus my proprietary client roster, the absolute lifeblood of my company, built upon relationships I had painstakingly cultivated over a grueling decade. I discovered the financial hemorrhage far too late. By the time the bank finally called to flag the discrepancies, the accounts were completely hollowed out, and my top-tier clients had been smoothly poached by Marcus's newly funded, flashy operation. The collapse of my firm was absolute, swift, and brutal. I was forced to absorb a devastating bankruptcy. The public shame of a failed business is a uniquely isolating agony. Colleagues who used to eagerly take my calls suddenly found themselves perpetually trapped in meetings. The narrative Helena enthusiastically spun within our social circles was that my gross incompetence had driven the business into the ground, and she had barely escaped the wreckage to find refuge with a true visionary. She paraded her upgraded, wealthy life with Marcus, draped entirely in the stolen spoils of my labor, while I sat alone in a bare, echoic apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes of worthless corporate documents. My legal team strongly advised a scorched-earth litigation strategy. They wanted to drag Helena and Marcus through civil court, to publicly expose the corporate fraud, and to claw back every stolen dollar. But a bitter, highly publicized war would have anchored me to them for a decade, tethering my energy and my future to their endless toxicity. I stared at the towering stack of legal briefs, the demands for depositions, and the prospect of endless mandated interactions, and I made a profoundly different choice. I chose absolute silence. I absorbed the catastrophic financial blow, swallowed the bitter injustice of it all, and walked away without looking back. Some men are permanently broken by the crushing weight of that kind of defeat. I use it as a foundational cornerstone. I learned the hard way that true power is not about striking back wildly when you are wounded. It is about possessing the discipline to disappear, to analyze the structural failures of your life, and to rebuild in the deep shadows where your enemies cannot track your progress. That agonizing silence became the fertile, undisturbed soil of my reinvention. It hardened my resolve and sharpened my strategic vision, forging the unseen empire I quietly commanded today. So, as Helena's laughter echoed across the plaza ballroom, I did not feel the agonizing sting of the past. I felt only the unyielding steel of the man I had been forced to become. The moment her eyes locked onto mine across the crowded floor, the trajectory of the evening was set. I watched the realization ripple across Helena's face, a fleeting second of genuine surprise quickly eclipsed by a predatory gleam. She whispered something to the tall, meticulously groomed man beside her. Marcus. He looked slightly older, his face pulled tight with strange, hollow exhaustion that high-end skincare could not entirely mask. But he dutifully followed as she began weaving to the crowd toward us. She moved with the aggressive confidence of someone who believes they unequivocally own the room, trailing a wake of curious onlookers in her path. They approached our small island of calm like a localized weather system. Helena's smile was wide, bright, and utterly devoid of warmth. She wore a striking crimson gown that demanded absolute attention, heavy diamonds resting against her collarbone. "Elias, goodness, it really is you," she announced, her voice pitched perfectly to ensure the surrounding circle of alumni halted their conversations to listen. "I have to admit, when I saw your name on the guest list, I was genuinely shocked. It takes an incredible amount of bravery to show your face at a high-profile event like this after, well, everything that happened. I did not flinch. I took a slow, measured breath, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the eavesdropping onlookers slightly uncomfortable before I offered polite, unwavering smile. Helena, it is a pleasure to see you looking so well. She didn't miss a beat. Her eyes immediately performed a rapid, forensic sweep of my attire. I could see her meticulously cataloging the absence of a recognizable designer logo, the lack of flashy timepiece, the simple, unadorned elegance of my charcoal jacket. Her smile sharpened into something deeply patronizing, an expression designed to wound. "Still keeping things simple, I see," she remarked, reaching out to adjust the lapel of Marcus's conspicuously branded tuxedo jacket, as if to draw a direct, undeniable comparison. "I suppose that's wise. I often wonder how you managed after the logistics business went so terribly under. Tell me, Elias, are you still digging yourself out from under all that awful debt? It must be completely exhausting to still be playing catch-up after 8 years. If you needed help covering the ticket for tonight's charity dinner, you honestly should have just called. Marcus and I would have been more than happy to sponsor your attendance." A heavy, stifling quiet descended upon the immediate vicinity. Several former classmates shifted awkwardly, their eyes darting between us, anticipating a fractured ego, a defensive remark, or a hasty, flush retreat. The social tension was suffocating. They expected the Elias of a decade ago, the man who would have crumbled under the sheer, agonizing weight of public humiliation. Instead, I simply looked at her. I didn't feel the sudden, burning need to defend the fabric of my suit or the balance of my private ledgers. Anger requires a level of emotional investment I was no longer willing to make. I held my glass of sparkling water, utterly unmoved by her theatrical venom. "That is exceptionally generous of you to offer," I replied, my tone perfectly even, grounded, and entirely devoid of sarcasm. "But I assure you, my affairs are in complete order. We are quite comfortable." Beside me, Clara did not bristle. She did not tighten her grip on my arm or shoot a withering, protective glare at the woman attempting to humiliate her husband. Clara simply stood there, radiating a serene, untouchable grace. She looked at Helena the way one might observe a particularly loud, frantic bird in a public park, with mild, detached curiosity. That unbreakable composure was a currency Helena did not understand, and it was entirely maddening to her. I watched a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of uncertainty cross my ex-wife's eyes. She had thrown a spear with all her might, expecting a spectacular collision, only to watch it pass harmlessly through empty air, leaving her awkwardly off balance in front of the very audience she had sought to entertain. Unsatisfied with the lack of reaction from her initial attack, Helena quickly pivoted to safer, more familiar territory, a loud, unsolicited monologue about their extraordinary success. She began regaling the small crowd with tales of Marcus's luxury import enterprise, dropping names of European shipping ports and casually mentioning the exorbitant cost of their newly acquired winter home in Aspen. The former classmates leaned in, enchanted by the glittering illusion of infinite wealth. But while her audience was captivated by the sparkling performance, my attention drifted entirely to the man standing silently beside her. Marcus was a study in profound, poorly concealed panic. To the casual observer, he might have seemed like just another wealthy executive patiently indulging his wife's relentless socializing. But I had spent the last 8 years operating at the absolute apex of the private equity sector, analyzing the subtle, involuntary tales of desperate men who were quietly bleeding to death on paper. I recognized the specific pathology of financial ruin instantly. Despite the immaculate Italian tailoring of his tuxedo, Marcus looked physically ill. A thin, cold sheen of sweat clung to his temples, catching the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers. His eyes were bloodshot, hollow, and erratic, darting anxiously around the grand ballroom without ever truly focusing on a single conversation. Every few seconds, his right hand twitched instinctively toward the inner pocket of his jacket. He would pull out his smartphone, stare at the blank screen with a desperate, crushing intensity, and shove it back away, only to repeat the cycle moments later. It was the frantic, compulsive behavior of a man waiting for a governor's pardon before scheduled execution. When a waiter glided past with a silver tray, Marcus abruptly seized a heavy crystal glass of scotch. He didn't sip it. He drained half the amber liquid in one ragged, unrefined swallow, his hand trembling so severely that the ice clinked sharply against the glass. He wasn't drinking to celebrate the opulent evening. He was drinking to temporarily paralyze a psychological terror that was threatening to consume him alive in front of 500 people. The dramatic irony of the situation was almost suffocating in its perfection. Beside him, Helena was currently and breathlessly detailing their fictional plans to expand luxury operations into exclusive Asian markets. She was completely oblivious to the fact that she was standing on a fragile trapdoor. I knew exactly the kind of message Marcus was waiting for. I knew that for the past 3 grueling months, his sprawling, allegedly prosperous import company had been hemorrhaging liquid cash at a catastrophic rate. He was drowning under a mountain of toxic debt, desperately seeking a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate bailout, just to stave off the absolute devastation of federal bankruptcy proceedings. He was a hollow ghost masquerading as a corporate titan. Helena continued to eagerly play the role of the invincible, untouchable socialite, utterly blind to reality that her new life was held together by frantic prayers and rapidly expiring lines of unsecured credit. As she laughed her piercing laugh once more, throwing her head back in feigned delight to impress a minor university official, a profound, chilling stillness washed over me. The entire social dynamic of our small circle had fundamentally shifted beneath their feet. I was no longer the tragic victim of her past cruelty, enduring a pathetic public lashing. I was a quiet, invisible architect standing in the center of the room, holding the absolute, devastating truth of their impending collapse. A melodic chime echoed softly through the grand ballroom, signaling the transition to the evening's centerpiece, the live charity auction. The glittering crowd naturally migrated toward the front stage, where a charismatic auctioneer prepared to peddle prestige under the guise of philanthropy. We took our seats at a quiet table near the middle of the room. Helena, naturally, maneuvered Marcus to a table positioned directly in the center aisle, ensuring maximum visibility for the entire alumni association. The auction was, in her eyes, never a vehicle for charitable giving. It was a ruthless, competitive arena for asserting public financial dominance. The first few items were modest, warming the crowd up before the premier lots were introduced to the floor. Then came lot number 7, a heavily publicized, needlessly extravagant 2-week charter on a Mediterranean superyacht, complete with a private chef and helicopter transfers. It was the absolute pinnacle of loud money. The bidding started fast, quickly escalating as a few wealthy alumni threw their paddles into the air. Helena's eyes locked onto the stage, hungry for the validation of the spotlight. She leaned over, gripping Marcus's forearm and whispering furiously into his ear. Marcus stared at the glossy auction brochure on their table, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. His face had completely drained of all color, taking on the sickly, translucent pallor of wet cement. He shook his head slightly, a frantic microgesture of pure, unadulterated panic. But Helena was relentless. Ignoring his clear physical distress, she forcefully grabbed his wrist, lifting his hand and the numbered auction paddle high into the air for the room to see. $50,000, she called out, her voice slicing sharply through the polite murmurs. A collective, impressed gasp rippled through the surrounding tables, followed by a smattering of enthusiastic applause. Marcus looked as though the oxygen had been violently vacuumed from his lungs. He swallowed hard, staring straight ahead. He was now publicly on the hook for $50,000 of liquid capital that he absolutely did not possess. The auctioneer gleefully confirmed the winning bid. Helena immediately turned in her chair, scanning the room to ensure everyone had witnessed her triumph. Her gaze deliberately lingered on me, a smug, radiant smirk painted across her lips. I simply looked away, feeling a profound wave of second-hand embarrassment for the terrified man beside her. A few lots later, the auctioneer presented a much quieter, less glamorous item, a first edition, leather-bound volume of the university's original architectural blueprints, complete with the founding dean's handwritten margin notes. It held zero flashy appeal. It offered no tropical excursions or VIP bottle service. It was simply a beautiful, forgotten piece of quiet history. When the bidding opened, I raised my paddle with a subtle, unhurried flick of the wrist, securing the artifact for a modest $5,000. The room remained perfectly quiet. There were no competing bids for something so deeply understated. As Clara smiled softly and placed a warm hand over mine in silent approval, Helena could not resist the opportunity to strike one more time. She leaned across the small gap between our tables, her voice dripping with artificial, cloying sympathy. "Oh, Elias, that is so sweet of you to participate. I know 5,000 must be a rather substantial stretch for your current budget, but every little bit helps the school, doesn't it?" She playfully patted Marcus on the shoulder as she said it, completely blind to the rigid terror seizing his entire frame. Marcus was staring blankly at the white tablecloth, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a sheer cliff, feeling the gravel finally crumble beneath his expensive shoes. Helena was eagerly celebrating a phantom victory, entirely unaware that the paddle she had just forced into the air was the final, devastating nail in their financial coffin. The anticipation humming steadily in my chest was absolute. The charity auction concluded to a final smattering of polite applause, and the waitstaff seamlessly transitioned the room, replacing empty champagne flutes with delicate porcelain cups of espresso. The ambient hum of wealthy conversation resumed. At the center table, Helena was still glowing, thoroughly intoxicated by the lingering afterglow of her $50,000 public stunt. She was busy recounting the fictional details of their upcoming Mediterranean voyage to anyone who would listen. I remained perfectly still, observing the theater of it all. Beside me, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration disturbed the quiet elegance of our table. It was Clara's phone, resting face down beside her water glass. Clara did not rush. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her espresso, gracefully turned the device over, and absorbed the brief notification illuminating the screen. Her expression remained entirely unchanged, preserving the immaculate mass of a woman enjoying a peaceful evening out. She set the phone down, leaned toward me just a fraction of an inch, and spoke in a voice so soft it was meant only for the space between us. The holding company just sent the rejection. I offered a microscopic nod. Not a smile, not a smirk. Just a silent acknowledgement of a meticulously executed maneuver finally reaching its conclusion. This was the quiet truth I had carried into the ballroom. I was not a struggling casualty of a decade-old divorce. I was the silent founder and majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings, a private equity firm specializing in the acquisition of distressed corporate assets. For the past 90 days, Marcus had been desperately begging Vanguard for a multi-million-dollar lifeline to save his sinking import enterprise. He had submitted frantic proposals, pleaded with my junior executives, and offered up every scrap of collateral he possessed. He had absolutely no idea that the ultimate arbiter of his survival was the man whose life he had helped dismantle 8 years ago. I did not operate in the spotlight. I operated in the shadows, as the invisible hand guiding the board. Just before the auction began, I had sent secure authorization to my executive team. The directive was absolute. Formally reject Marcus's final plea for a bailout, and immediately initiate the legal process to call in his massive outstanding debts. The guillotine had fallen, entirely in silence. Across the ballroom, Marcus was still staring blankly at the white tablecloth. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. The harsh, rattling sound was audible even over the surrounding chatter. He lunged to the device with the frantic desperation of a drowning man. I watched him unlock the screen. I watched his eyes scan the brief, clinical email from a Vanguard legal department, formally informing him that all avenues of financial assistance were officially closed. The physical reaction was immediate and devastating. The final trace of color vanished from his face, replaced by an ashen, corpse-like gray. His jaw slackened. The hand holding the phone began to tremble so violently he was forced to press it flat against the table just to maintain his grip. The $50,000 he had just publicly committed to charity was no longer an arrogant display of wealth. It was a catastrophic liability, an outright fraud committed in front of the city's most elite residents. Beside him, Helena laughed at a passing joke, utterly oblivious to the reality that the man sitting next to her had just financially flatlined. I took a slow breath, tasting the profound, undeniable satisfaction of a war won without ever having to lift a finger. The gala transitioned smoothly into a brief intermission before the evening's keynote addresses. The heavy mahogany ballroom doors were opened to let in the crisp, cooling night air, and the glittering guests began to mingle, forming new clusters of animated conversation. Clara and I stepped away from our table, finding a quiet, dimly lit alcove near the terrace to enjoy a moment of relative solitude. I was perfectly content to let the rest of the evening play out from a comfortable distance. Helena, however, was entirely incapable of leaving a perceived victory uncelebrated. The spotlight was a drug she could never quite quit. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched her detach herself from her surrounding admirers. Marcus remained seated at their table, staring into the middle distance with a glassy, unblinking focus, like a man who had just been pronounced clinically dead, but Helena paid him no mind. She was riding the high of her $50,000 bid, intoxicated by the fumes of her own grand illusion. She glided across the floor toward us, her crimson dress catching the light, her expression molded into a mask of supreme, condescending triumph. "I just want to come over and say a proper goodbye before the speeches drag on," Helen announced, inserting herself into our quiet space without invitation. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, her eyes dragging over me with a look of manufactured pity. "Seeing you tonight, Elias, it really put everything into perspective for me. It confirmed something I have always believed. The world naturally sorts itself out, doesn't it? Some men are simply born to build empires, to shape the world around them, and some men are just meant to exist at the absolute bottom of the food chain, picking up the scraps. I do hope you eventually find a way to be at peace with your limitations." I drew a steady breath, fully prepared to offer her nothing more than a polite nod and walk away. But before I could shift my weight, Clara stepped forward. She moved with a fluid, lethal grace, placing herself subtly between Helena and me. Clara did not raise her voice. She did not adopt a defensive posture, nor did her expression harden into defensive anger. Instead, her features softened into a look of profound, aristocratic sympathy. It was the exact expression one might use when comforting a child who has just dropped their ice cream onto the pavement. "Helena," Clara murmured, her tone gentle, flawlessly modulated, and devastatingly sincere. "I can only imagine how exhausting it must be for you." Helena blinked, her smug smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me?" "The sheer weight of keeping up this kind of relentless performance," Clara continued softly, her eyes resting on Helena with genuine pity. "It takes a tremendous toll on a person's spirit. But you really should go check on Marcus. He looks terribly unwell, and he is going to need you to be incredibly strong for him tonight." Clara reached out, lightly grazing Helena's arm with the tips of her fingers, a gesture of ultimate, untouchable superiority masked as comfort. "Financial ruin is so incredibly hard on a relationship. Do be gentle with him." Helena recoiled, physically snatching her arm back as if she had been burned. Her eyes widened, flashing with a sudden, volatile mixture of bewilderment and deep offense. She entirely misread Clara's factual warning, interpreting it as the petty, jealous lash-out of a woman married to a failure. "How absolutely dare you?" Helena scoffed, her voice tight and trembling with indignation. "You have no idea who you are speaking to. My partner is a titan. You are utterly pathetic, both of you." She turned sharply on her heel, her crimson gown swishing furiously as she marched back toward the center of the ballroom, fiercely clutching her champagne glass. Clara watched her go, a serene, unbothered smile resting on her lips. She had not raised her voice or resorted to a single cheap insult. She had simply handed Helena the unvarnished truth, elegantly wrapped in a velvet ribbon, and allowed her to walk blindly into the devastating reality awaiting her. The lights in the grand ballroom dimmed, shifting the focus entirely to the illuminated stage at the far end of the room. The ambient chatter dissolved into a respectful hush as the university president stepped up to the crystal podium, adjusting the microphone with a soft, resonant tap. We stood near the periphery, perfectly positioned to observe the entire floor. At the center table, Helena was still rigidly gripping her champagne flute, her jaw tight with lingering indignation, while Marcus remained completely motionless beside her, a hollow shell of man staring into the abyss. "Ladies and gentlemen," the president began, his voice echoing across the vast expanse of the ballroom. Tonight, we have gathered to celebrate the enduring legacy of this institution. We have witnessed tremendous generosity, but it is my profound privilege to announce a milestone that will alter the trajectory of this university forever. A palpable sense of anticipation settled over the crowd. People leaned forward in their chairs. For the past several years, the president continued, a single anonymous benefactor has been quietly observing our progress. Today, that individual has chosen to step out of the shadows. Thanks to a staggering $50 million endowment, the university will break ground next month on a state-of-the-art economics and ethics wing, fully funded in perpetuity. A collective, breathless gasp swept through the 500 guests. $50 million. It was a sum so vast, so completely out of the realm of ordinary affluence, that it instantly reduced the evening's earlier displays of wealth to microscopic trivialities. Helena's $50,000 vacation bid was suddenly rendered as insignificant as a dropped coin on the pavement. This monumental gift comes from an organization built on the very principles of rigorous ethics and visionary restructuring, the president said, his smile widening as he looked out into the crowd. It is my greatest honor to finally introduce the architect of this incredible contribution. Please join me in welcoming the founder and majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings. For a fraction of a second, the room remained perfectly still, waiting to see which titan of industry would rise to claim the applause. I released a slow, steady breath. Beside me, Clara offered a soft, knowing smile and gently released my hand. I reached down, calmly buttoned the center button on my unbranded charcoal jacket, and stepped out of the shadows of the alcove. I did not stride with arrogance, nor did I look toward the center table. I simply walked down the main aisle with the quiet, measured pace of a man taking a stroll in his own garden. As I moved into the light, polite applause began to ripple through the crowd, but it was quickly swallowed by a sweeping, stunned silence. People recognized me. Whispers ignited and spread like a brush fire across the tables as the realization cascaded through the Alumni Association. The man they had pitied, the man they had believed was ruined, was a billionaire benefactor standing before them. From the corner of my eye, I caught the exact moment Helena's reality fractured. She was paralyzed, her body frozen in a posture of absolute shock. Her mouth parted slightly, but no sound emerged. Her mind was frantically trying to reconcile the pathetic, broken failure she had fabricated in her head with the sovereign force of nature now ascending the stage stairs. But Helena's shock was a minor tragedy compared to the catastrophic psychological collapse occurring in the chair next to her. Marcus slowly lifted his head. The glassy, catatonic stare broke as the sheer, devastating gravity of the moment crushed the remaining oxygen from his lungs. He watched me stand behind the podium. He heard the name Vanguard Holdings ringing in the air. The final, fatal pieces of the puzzle snapped violently into place in his mind. The faceless corporate entity that had just decisively rejected his frantic pleas for a bailout, the invisible executioner who had effectively ended his empire an hour ago, was the very man whose life he had helped dismantle 8 years prior. I looked out over the sea of faces, letting my gaze sweep over the room before briefly, fleetingly, resting on Marcus. I offered no smirk, no triumphant glare, just a look of absolute, chilling indifference. And in that heavy, suffocating silence, the velvet guillotine fell, witnessed by the entire world. I adjusted the microphone, the slight electronic feedback echoing across the dead-silent ballroom. I did not look at the center table. I did not seek the faces of those who had eagerly gathered to watch my supposed downfall only an hour prior. My gaze remained anchored on the quiet pride in Clara's eyes. True infrastructure, I began, my voice steady, is rarely built in the daylight. The most critical foundations are laid in the dark, far beneath the surface, where no one is watching. 8 years ago, I learned that a man's worth is not defined by what is taken from him, but by what he chooses to construct from the wreckage. This endowment is a commitment to the architects of tomorrow, to those who understand that absolute integrity is the only currency that never depreciates. Thank you. There was no grandstanding, no veiled threats, and absolutely no performative victory laps. The applause that followed was not the polite smattering of charity dinner. It was a heavy, thunderous ovation of profound respect. I stepped down from the stage, offered a brief handshake to the university president, and rejoined Clara. Without a word, we both knew the evening was complete. We made our seamless exit, leaving the ballroom to digest the seismic shift in reality. The opulent marble lobby of the plaza was mostly deserted, save for a few coat attendants and the distant strains of jazz bleeding through the heavy doors. But as we approached the grand exit, we found our departure briefly delayed. Helena and Marcus were standing near the grand staircase. The polished, untouchable facade they had worn all evening had violently disintegrated. Marcus was leaning heavily against the balustrade, his hands cover his face, his shoulders shaking with the ragged, uncontrollable sobs of a man who had lost everything. The words tumbled from his mouth in a frantic, broken confession. He wept about the toxic debt, the rejected Vanguard bailout, the impending federal bankruptcy, and the terrifying reality that her $50,000 charity bid was money they absolutely did not possess. Helena stood completely paralyzed, the color drained from her face, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. The luxurious life she had proudly paraded, the empire she thought she had stolen, was nothing more than an elaborate illusion built on a foundation of sand. And the tide had just rolled in. Hearing our footsteps, Helena snapped her head up, her eyes locked onto mine. In that fractured moment, I saw exactly what she wanted. She desperately searched my face for anger, for a smug, gloating smirk, for any sign of lingering resentment. Because anger requires emotional investment. Anger would mean that after 8 years, she still held some fragment of power over my soul. I felt absolutely nothing. The space where the pain and betrayal used to live was entirely hollowed out, replaced by a deep, unshakable peace. I did not break my stride. As we passed them, I offered her a single, polite, perfectly indifferent nod, the exact courtesy one afforded a stranger on a crowded street. Her shoulders slumped, crushed by the devastating realization that the opposite of love isn't hate. It is complete indifference. Clara squeezed my hand, and we walked through the brass revolving doors, leaving the ghosts of the past behind as we stepped out into the crisp, quiet night air. The city passed in a blur of gold and amber streetlights as we navigated the quiet, damp avenues leading away from Plaza. Inside the car, the silence was a tangible, beautiful thing. There was no need for a debrief, no lingering adrenaline to dissect or celebrate. Clara rested her head gently against my shoulder, her hand resting warmly over mine. Behind us, a ballroom was still reeling from the shock waves of shattered reality, but in the quiet, leather-scented sanctuary of the back seat, the world was perfectly, effortlessly still. I looked out at the passing architecture and thought deeply about the 8 years that had led to this exact moment. I remember the grueling, empty nights in that bare, echoing apartment, staring at the ceiling and wondering if the sheer, suffocating weight of betrayal would eventually break me. There were distinct moments in those early days when the climb seemed entirely impossible, when the burning desire to scream at the staggering unfairness of it all threatened to consume my focus. But I had chosen a different path. I had chosen to funnel every ounce of that despair into the bedrock of something unbreakable. The vindication in the ballroom tonight was deeply satisfying, certainly, but as the rhythmic passing of the streetlights washed over the interior of the car, I realized it was merely a minor footnote in a much larger, more important narrative. The greatest victory of the evening was not the look of absolute, paralyzing devastation on my ex-wife's face, nor was it the imminent collapse of the man who had stolen my livelihood. Those outcomes were just the natural, inevitable consequences of their own hollow, deceitful architecture collapsing under its own weight. My true victory was a profound realization that I no longer needed their defeat to validate my existence. True wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the commas on a bank statement or the stunned applause of a crowded room. True wealth is the unshakable, quiet peace waiting for you at the end of the day. It is the steady, reliable rhythm of a life built on uncompromising integrity and the quiet comfort of a woman who believed in your strength long before the world ever knew your name. As we pulled into our driveway, the heavy iron door of my past finally swung shut in my mind, the rusted lock clicking securely into place. I was completely, unequivocally healed. People often say that living well is the best revenge, But what they fail to mention is that if you live well enough, you eventually stop caring about revenge altogether. You simply move forward, building monuments in the silence, leaving the noise far behind you. If this journey resonated with you tonight, and if you believe in the quiet, enduring power of resilience over retribution, I invite you to like this video, share it with someone who might be quietly rebuilding their own life, and subscribe to our community. Some of the most beautiful empires are built in the shadows, and there are many more stories left to tell.